and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. In this episode of the Books on Asia podcast, I talk with Iain Maloney about living in Japan's countryside. Iain, in his book, The Only Gaijin in the Village, A Year Living in Rural Japan, documents his move to Gifu Prefecture with his Japanese wife, while I discuss living on a small Japanese island of just 430 people in my own book, The Widow, the Priest, and the Octopus Hunter, Discovering a Lost Way of Life on a Secluded Japanese Island. Today, Iain and I will discuss our experiences, why we moved to the countryside, how we bought a house, how we fixed it up. We'll talk about acceptance and non-acceptance into the communities. We'll talk about Japanese toilets and lots more. See the show notes for definitions of Japanese words you may not be familiar with, such as gaijin, which means a non-Japanese person. So, welcome, Iain.
Hi, good morning.
You published your book, The Only Gaijin in the Village, in March of 2020, and your book is about how you and your Japanese wife moved out to the countryside. And I would like you to first just let our listeners know what made you decide to move out to the countryside.
It's kind of a difficult question. There's many reasons went into that. I mean, my wife and I both grew up in the countryside. So she grew up in Gifu in Japan, and I grew up in Aberdeenshire in Scotland. So we're both kind of not city people anyway. But we've been living in a commuter town outside Nagoya for a few years, and small apartment, narrow balcony, no garden, all that kind of stuff. We were getting a bit sick of it and wanted a bit of space, wanted the garden. So we started house hunting around Japan and spent years, actually 3-4 years, looking all over Japan, not just in Gifu, for the right place. And then eventually we found it. So yeah, kind of combination of factors.
So you really wanted to get out of the city, though, basically, and have maybe a better lifestyle as far as space and being able to maybe farm or grow some vegetables, be able to have your campfires.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, all of those things. As I say, I grew up in the countryside. So, having a bonfire in the garden and being able to grow vegetables, grow plants, just be outside in nature. I work in Nagoya at a university in Nagoya, and you're just surrounded by concrete all the time. So when I go home, and particularly at the weekends, wake up on a Saturday morning, there's just greenery and mountains, and it's just so much better for your mental health than anything. Waking up in the noise of the big city has never been relaxing for me. I mean, you must find the same thing out on your island.
Yes, I grew up in Ohio in the U.S., and I used to wake up to cows mooing. So nice. I really miss that. Although I do love the birds that you get in the countryside here. That's very nice.
And that is actually one big difference, because Scotland's the same with all the livestock. There's not, certainly around me, there's not fields full of cows or sheep or even horses, anything like that. I do miss that. You get it a bit more in Hokkaido, but certainly not in Gifu.
Yeah, it's not that they don't have the livestock, it's that they're inside barns usually because there's no space.
Yeah, not an ideal life for a cow. But.
No, definitely not. So then when you found your house, did you go about fixing it up, or what kind of house was it?
It was a reasonably new house. It was built about 20 years ago, and it had been quite well looked after. The owners were an elderly couple who were selling it so they could move closer to their daughter in Kagoshima. So they'd been living there and looked after it. So we thought everything was fine. We thought there was no problems with it. And then, and my wife's brother is a carpenter. He builds houses. So he'd given it a good check over and was like, yeah, it looks okay. There's no subsidence, no earthquake damage. And then about a month after we'd moved in, my wife's brother was down. I can't remember why he was down there. He was down in the crawl space below the ground floor and found a lot of water, which is, there should not be water in the foundations, particularly in a Japanese house where there's lots of wood in the construction. And we discovered that the bath the drain out of the bath, the pipe just went nowhere. It just ended about 2 feet under the bath. So every time you pulled the plug on the bath water was just flooding into the foundations.
And it had been doing this for 20 years?
Presumably. I mean, I can't imagine just before moving out, the old guy climbed down below and removed the pipe as like an act of sabotage or something. I suspect it had just always been there. So, yeah, we had to pull out the entire bathroom, destroy the cement floor and fix everything. Luckily, it wasn't too badly damaged. We had to replace some pillars. But yeah, you just move in and you have to completely replace a bathroom, which is not a cheap job to do. That was not nice. That was very stressful. But apart from that, we've had no problems. And the house was in good condition. The garden needs a lot of looking after, but that's gardens. That's one of the reasons we moved out. There are a lot of trees, especially big cherry blossom trees, and they take a lot of maintenance. But yeah, apart from that, it was all good. How about you? How was yours?
Well, I know a lot of people have this dream of moving to Japan and fixing up an old Japanese style house. And I can't say that we actually did that. However, my husband, he's Australian and he is a carpenter. And so he couldn't wait to get into the house and start making changes. And our house isn't that old either. It was built in the 80s. So it's not a Japanese style house architecturally, but of course it was built with a Japanese architect. We still had these big, huge old beams inside it, which we've recently exposed. And we've done a lot of work on it. And of course, the pit toilet. So we redid that. And on islands, all of the houses do have pit toilets, as I imagine they do in any countryside village in Japan.
Yeah, we only got connected to like the proper sewage system last year.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I think, yeah. And just after we moved in, they put pipes down the street and connected it to nothing. They just put the pipe down and like, right, if you want to join, you have to pay. You have to get your workers in. So, yeah, we sort of did nothing for a while because, again, that's quite an expensive job. But, yeah, we're planning a bit of remodeling the garden, and we don't want to do that when sometime in the future we're going to have to dig everything up and put pipes and stuff in. So sort of bit the bullet and did it.
You have the infrastructure, though, to work with, so that's good. I don't think they ever plan on bringing flush toilets and plumbing to the island here. So it's something we still deal with, is having a pit toilet that they have to come out and clean every month. But at least when I first came, and this was a major decision as to whether I was going to take the house or not, was that it was a Japanese style toilet, a squat toilet, which is fine with me. But you could just look down and see everything that had been deposited in the toilet by every family member over the past month. And so once we put in the Western style toilet over that, then of course you don't have to look into that. And so it made a huge difference. And you can even put in things so that, you can have a semi-flush. So that was a good move to change that.
Yeah, we were like, the house itself was fine. You had Western style toilets and things.
That's good to know, because I know everyone's experience in the countryside is different for foreigners. And it's nice to hear that there was a nice modern house in the countryside, because it's not something I think of. I always think of these, old broken down akiya houses that are empty and kind of slowly disintegrating, that need to be rescued and given a loving, parent to take care of them, nurture them back into the grand edifice that they used to be.
Yeah, I mean, there are those around us. There's one being done up just around the corner from us just now, and it looks amazing. I'm really curious. I want to go in and see what they're doing. And we looked at a few like sort of really old classical, like those spreading bungalow kind of houses. But there was always, as I say, my wife's brother's a carpenter. He'd come with us, and he was always like, yeah, this is way more work than you actually think. Like, even replacing it bit by bit, at some point, the whole thing's just going to fall down, because they're wood mainly. and there was always other issues with them. Yeah, we ended up with this. But part of the reason was, and this confused our realtor, our Fudo-san, and it confused the owners, is we didn't really care too much about the house itself. All our plans were about the garden, about the land. We want the top things on the list, where we want space to grow vegetables. We want space to be able to have fires and have barbecues. We want trees so we can have some privacy and be protected from the wind. And the Fudo-san would say, and the house, what kind of house do you want? And we're like, I don't know, nice space. I was like, I would like high door frames so I don't keep hitting my head. That's kind of important. And I got that. I don't know why our house, the original architect added about 0.5 meter onto the standard roof size. So we've got surprisingly high ceilings for a Japanese house, which I'm over 6 foot tall. So that's ideal. It's perfect.
My husband has just finished, finally, after 20 years, of raising all of the doorways in the entire house. And he's so happy he will never hit his head again.
The apartment we used to live in, I seriously contemplated just cutting a head-shaped hole in each one so I could just pass through every time. But I still do. I still hit my head on other things, cupboards, and in our kitchen, there's like low cupboards. So it never ends.
You can actually get in the DIY stores here, because everyone's getting taller, the Japanese, and you can get these strips that you can put on the corners of your doorways and stuff, so that if you do hit your head, it'll give it a cushion.
Yeah, it's kind of like child-proofing it, but for taller people.
Exactly.
I think after I've been here, 16, 17 years now, I think that the damage has been done. When
you moved out to the countryside with your wife, it's a complete contrast, I believe, to me. When I moved to the island, I was by myself. And so I just had to deal with the regular Gaijin stuff. And I had no one to say, oh, Amy, really, you should do this, or you shouldn't do that. So I'm wondering what it's like to move to the countryside with a Japanese spouse who can kind of give you a clue as to what's, you should be doing and not be doing. And on the other hand, it can also be a bit of an impediment, because then you might feel like you have to follow the rules, where I've never felt like I had to follow the rules, nor do I necessarily want to. And I know that's one of the big complaints about foreigners in Japan, is you're never accepted into the Japanese community. But I've always realized that if I'm accepted, that means I have to do all these obligatory things as well, which I really don't have any interest in doing. So I've always kind of treasured being a foreigner, having that choice that I can make, and being an outsider looking in. So what's your take on that?
I'd agree with all of that. There's moving with my wife obviously initially made everything so much easier. I mean, just the practical things of, getting a mortgage and going through all the paperwork. And, I was signing mortgage papers in Japanese and going, I can read maybe 40% of this form. I have no idea. Even in English, I don't know what mortgage forms say. So like that side of things. And then joining the neighborhood association, meeting the neighbors, that was all much smoother, because she kind of already knew what to expect and knew what our neighbors would be looking for and expecting. So that made it easier or less stressful for me. I think it was more stressful for her, because like if a Japanese couple moves to the Japanese countryside, they can share that load a bit. But, there was much more emphasis on her having to deal with problems than me. And there's pros with that. The cons with that are more that sort of made me feel more out of it. Like in your situation, you have to deal with things if you're by yourself. You have to go out and be proactive and talk to people. I could just sort of hide behind my wife a bit more and like, hey, can you go and talk to the neighbors? Can you go and deal with this? Which is not good, for just getting out there and meeting people and becoming part of the community. It's also not good for my language, for my Japanese skills. If every time it gets hard, it's like, Minori, please help. So that's not great. On the other hand, one of the things I didn't expect, and I've seen quite a lot, is that my wife tends to overthink things a bit too much when dealing with the neighbours and the neighbourhoods association, because there are all these levels and all these the issues of hierarchy in society and all the expectations and the differences between communities. Because my wife grew up in Gifu, but not in this area. It's a different area, and every area has its own customs and rules and different ways of doing things.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, I will do. That combined with the Japanese desire never to be completely direct when they're speaking, particularly when you're complaining, caused her to overthink things quite a lot, whereas me, much more direct and get over them. The first time this came up, which I write about in the book, is when we moved in. I was ferrying our belongings back and forth from our old apartment while my wife and her parents were sort of at the house, moving everything in and tidying up. And I came back at one point with a carload of boxes to find my wife incredibly stressed out. And she had a visit from the head of the neighbourhood association and one of the neighbours. And the way she tells it, they were both very angry and complaining about our trees. On our bushes, like on the edge of the land, and the fact that they were overhanging and leaves were falling down, and this was a huge problem, and we needed to deal with it immediately.
So nature was a huge problem.
Yeah, and I mean, it still is. This is the downside of trees. It's one reason a lot of people cut down their trees, is the leaves go everywhere in autumn, and it's very beautiful, but not when they're in your neighbour's guttering. So, my wife is really stressed out about this. We've been there 1 or 2 days, and already we've got a problem with the neighbours. So the next morning, I was out in the garden and I saw the neighbour that had come over. So I went over and introduced myself and sort of in my broken Japanese sort of said, look, I understand there's a problem with their trees, but like, we haven't even moved in yet. Can you please be a little bit patient? And he reacted like, what problem? What are you talking about? I was like, oh, you said to my wife that there's a problem with the trees. He's like, no, there's no problem. It's just, I was pointing out the line of demarcation. These are my trees and I'll look after them, and these are your trees and they're your responsibility. And, where it overhangs the road, even though it's the prefecture's land on the road, that's still kind of your responsibility to clean it up. They're beautiful cherry trees. He was like, don't cut them down. Please don't do anything. Don't misunderstand me. And it was just that. My wife had totally overthought what they were saying, thinking about all these different layers and indirect meaning. And because my Japanese wasn't good enough at the time, and because I didn't understand all the structures, I could just go, is there a problem? No, there's no problem. Okay, done, finished. And that's happened a few times since. It keeps cropping up that as a foreigner, you're not expected to understand all the nuances and different levels, and that can actually simplify things that could be more problematic.
It's a good point, because often that's kind of the way the Japanese work, is that they don't want to confront something head on. So they'll just kind of suggest it. And that's like your cue is to, oh, that's what I should be doing. But then if you come back and say, oh, didn't you say that I should do this? They'll be like, no, I didn't say that. So, and there's this suggestion thing. And now I really key into that when I hear someone say something, I'm like, that means I'm supposed to do it. So like you said, it doesn't mean you have to do it now or this or that. It just means that, this is something that you should consider listening to. With
that one, we also learned afterwards that it was more, they had a problem with the previous owner who hadn't been looking after his bushes properly. Like they were really pushing out into the one of our neighbours. She couldn't dry her washing because the trees were blocking the sunlight, and we had no idea about that. So they were basically going, the last guy was a problem. So please don't be like that guy.
And do you think that you've been accepted into the community?
I think so, yeah. There was the first 2 or 3 months were quite funny. It was basically most of our neighbours are elderly and retired, and we just every day find somebody in our garden or sort of hanging around just outside the garden, sort of going, oh, where's the new foreigner? And like once word got around that I could actually speak Japanese, they're like, the curiosity built up, and they all came to quiz me about where I was from and that kind of thing, which was nice. There was no, it was all friendly curiosity rather than who are you, why are you here, why did you buy a house. It was all just the kind of conversations you have with elderly people in any country. It's like, where are you from, what's your job, what are you doing. And then after about 3 months that just stopped, and at first I was like, have I done something wrong? And it transpired basically they just got bored. I'd answered all the questions and I wasn't creating any problems or any gossip for them. So they're just like, oh yeah, he's just living here now. And I consider that to be acceptance. They've got bored of me and don't feel like, they found something else to interest them somewhere else. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm just part of the scenery now. So that was good. I mean, to a certain extent, I will never be as accepted as a Japanese person would moving in. But also, like, my wife isn't fully part of that community for a number of reasons. She wasn't born there, so the people who are born there are a community within a community. And I've seen it since with other Japanese couples that have moved into the area. They're like kind of much less accepted than I am at the moment, just on time. I've been there slightly longer, which is odd. And it's odd for them as well, because there's a guy I talk to occasionally who moved in about 3 years after us, and he thinks of me as being newer than him because I'm a foreigner, whereas everyone else is kind of like, no, Iain's been here, he's done his jobs, but he's just got, in his imagination, it's like there's this community, and there's the foreigner, and I'm separate to that, so it kind of doesn't quite compute with him. He's very nice about it, it's not a problem, but it's just that he periodically says something that sounds like he thinks he's been there longer than I have. It's just like, yeah, no, I've done this cycle of garbage collection or cleanup or whatever it is a few more times. But yeah, there's been no problems that I'm aware of. I did have one guy who very, very honestly spoke to me after a few years and said that there'd been a certain amount of concern amongst the gossips, I guess, that they heard a foreigner is buying a house, but they didn't know which kind of foreigner, if you know what I mean, like where is he from? And there was a certain amount of stereotyping of, if it's a foreigner from this kind of community or this kind of community, like, are they going to be noisy and have lots of barbecues and play music late at night? Or are they going to have huge families that come over all the time? Like, what sort of foreigner? And there's a bit of that good foreigner, bad foreigner stereotyping going on. And then they said, when we found out you were from Britain, okay, that's fine. That's not a problem. And I was like, I'm not happy with that. Like, that's not really a good thing to be admitting. But thank you for your honesty. So that was a bit strange.
Interesting. Yeah. There was no process you had to go through then to become a member of the community. Like here in our island, when I wanted to start a business, I found an old house to work out of, but then I had to ask my neighbors on each side if it was okay. And so I went with, the authority on the island, and he went around and helped me with this, and they all said, okay, that's fine. And there's also, as I talk about in my own book, there's a process actually of, gatekeeping as to who can come in and who can't. And it's pretty stringent, and I'm just glad that wasn't in place when I came. Or maybe it's why it's in place, I don't know. But I have noticed that when it comes to outsiders coming into our small community, and it is different because it is secluded. It's not a place you can even just get in the car and drive to. You have to get on a ferry and come out, which means that even though it's easy to do, most people don't do it. But all outsiders are looked on with suspicion, whether you're a foreigner or not. And of course, in Japanese, not being accepted into the community, or some people call it ostracization, is called murahachibu. But I think now I understand that much more than I did before. Before, I thought murahachibu was just arbitrary. that we don't want outsiders. But actually, outsiders can be a problem, especially when people bring their city problems with them into a small community. So I understand that they've lived here a long time and they think things are fine the way they are. And once they open it up, it's just like tourism, right? They just don't want a bunch of new people coming in and introducing new ways when they're pretty happy with their old ways.
Yeah, I was interested in that when I was reading your book about that sort of role. I guess with an island, there's only a certain amount of space anyway that's never going to change. With our area, there was much less of that, or certainly I wasn't aware of it. If there was, we sort of like, by the time we met Hancho-san and all the Chonakai people, all those kind of things, we'd already bought the house and moved in and were living there. So there wasn't much they could really have done to say you can't live here. It was sort of a done deal. The only rule I'm aware of, so in our area, there's a rule that you're not allowed any kind of business run there. It's residential land or farmland only. For example, if I wanted to open a language school or something like that in my house and teach English, then yeah, I think I'd have to go around and get some hankos and get some verbal permission. But we haven't tried anything like that. It's just our house and our garden, and that's it. And there's no other businesses at all going on in that area. So yeah, I'm not really aware of anything. There's a fair bit of space, and I think because the neighbours are mainly elderly and all the young people have gone away, there's a certain amount of realism about that. About we do need people coming in, and I think they prefer people with children. And my wife and I don't have kids. There's a certain amount of let's bring in young families as much as we can. There's a kindergarten and there's an elementary school and a junior high school nearby, and they're sort of, the class sizes are getting smaller and smaller and smaller every year. So the people with kids are scared that their kids are then those schools will close and their kids will then have to travel much further from school. So there's a certain amount of being proactive, I guess, about bringing people in.
Interesting, because I would have thought that would be the case here too, but it's actually much more fatalistic here. People aren't actually interested in new families coming in. And we have something called Akiya Taisaku, and Akiya is empty house. And then Taisaku is trying to do something to counter that. And so when people are interested in moving to these islands, and there are a group of 5 of them, what they did is they divided them up and said, oh, those who have children, will encourage them to go to this island. Those people who are retired, just a couple, will encourage them to go to this island. And it seems a strange system to try to control what should be a natural thing. You should be choosing a place according to whether you like it, if the people are nice, if the environment's good, or where the house available, the Akiya is. And also the fact that your house, you went through a real estate agent, means a lot, because that just doesn't exist here. And I think, again, it's a way to protect, in quotes, the community. So I think when I came, it was easier for me because I was a single woman, which is the most non-threatening thing you can be. I was a foreigner, so there was some intrigue there. And as soon as I moved in, I was already being asked to teach English to people's kids. And so I did that. And I also taught at the elementary school just once a month, and on a volunteer basis. I insisted it be volunteer. But they felt, oh, here's something we can kind of have fun with. So I didn't feel that it was any imposition to people. On the other hand, naturally, I have different customs, and there were definitely things that threw the people off. And I was lucky to have, as my next door neighbor, I only have one neighbor, and she's right next door. The 2 houses are right next to each other. And I was really lucky that she had quite a bit of experience with foreigners. And she didn't speak any English, but she definitely had experience. So she would come over and tell me something that she thought I should know. For example, when I moved in, she told me, what you really need to do is go house to house in our neighborhood and introduce yourself and take a gift. So I did do that. And she even went with me. And so she really held my hand through a lot of these processes. And it just makes everything smoother and better. And then a year after I lived here, we got our first Chinese person who came in. And she came in as a wife to a Japanese fisherman from China. And then she ended up bringing 3 of her friends in over the next 5 years. So we have 4 Chinese wives married to Japanese here. And by now, their kids have all grown up. I think there's still one in high school, but the others are in college. And that was also our neighborhood. So we were so international. We had me, I'm American, my Australian husband, and these Chinese women. And so we kind of all had a lot of fun with that.
That's cool. That's really nice. Yeah.
You can see the way they bring people in, outsiders if they want, if they're advantageous.
Yeah. I think with my area, there's a fear that if they're too strict, like not dealing with people coming in, but if they're too strict, the people who are already there, like the young families that are already there, might leave, that they might push them away. And I've seen this happening with one of my neighbors when the grandfather passed away. Like, he was heavily involved in the community. And when he passed away, they immediately quit the neighborhood association. They said, right, he's gone. We want nothing more to do with this now. No one in the family is going to step up. And everyone was like, oh, what's going to happen? Like, if you leave the neighborhood association, usually that means, like, you can't get your garbage collected. You're not involved in anything. You're ostracized, as you say. And like, everyone was sort of watching to see what would happen. And absolutely nothing happens. Their garbage still gets collected. They're still effectively part of the community. They just don't have to go to meetings. They don't have to pay the membership money. And they don't have to go to do all the duties. So now everyone is sort of gossiping like, oh, well, if they can leave and there's no punishment, then maybe the rest of us can as well. So the elderly people who are heavily involved in running it are clearly now getting a bit scared, like, hang on, this whole thing is going to fall apart if we try to push people too much, if we're too strict, if we make them come to too many meetings. And you combine that with Corona, where in our area, everything has just been cancelled for 2 years. There's been no meetings, nothing, for obvious reasons. And everyone's really got used to that. And they're like, yeah, no, it's nice. We don't have to come in at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night to be told about someone's farm.
I wanted to talk about the neighborhood association because for myself, I don't know exactly what happens with the neighborhood association. I'm not a part of it, or, well, we are, but because we don't have a native Japanese speaker, we're not asked to do anything. Although we do, for example, take part in neighborhood cleanups, cutting grass, weeding, and such. We also do around the shrine twice a year, and we do around the temple 4 times a year. And actually, even the temple is really just for danka, the parishioners, people who belong to the temple, but everyone seems to do it anyway. And we also do it as well. We actually enjoy doing it. And it's a bit of fun, and you can catch up with your neighbors and such. And each neighborhood has a certain section around the temple or shrine that they do each time. You mentioned garbage. We do take turns, especially on the recycled garbage day, helping people separate their garbage when they put it out. A lot of people are elderly, so we help take care of that for them. If they'll push their carts to the garbage collection area, and then from there we'll take it and separate it for them and such. I'm trying to think of what else the neighborhood association does. There's the Kaidanban, which is the book that goes from house to house. And once you get the book, in our case, it would be, for example, a notice that the health boat is coming. And if you want to go and get an X-ray of some sort on this day when the health boat is here between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., then sign up. And then you check off that you've seen this, and then you walk it over to the next house and leave it there. And it goes around like that. And I'm trying to think, what else is involved with the neighborhood association in your case?
With us, it's about the same. I think everything you've described is we have to do that. We don't have to clean or tidy up at the temple. That's in another area. We've got the meeting room, the big meeting hall. We have to clean once a year. Everyone takes a turn once a year cleaning that, which is a great job because it's never used. So when you go in, there's like a thin layer of dust and nothing else. Like it never gets actually dirty.
What about the festivals?
So there's a small festival that the local children take part in. So if you have children, you're involved in that. And we don't, so we're not expected to be part of it. You have to take your turn as the hancho, like the head of the area, the head of the association, it's like a 1 year cycle. And everyone has to do that within reason. So we had to do it a couple of years ago. And that's kind of the worst thing because you're sort of the boss. You have to be involved in everything that's going on. But one of our neighbours didn't have to do it because she's a 76-year-old woman who lives by herself and doesn't get around all that well. So things like going house to house, delivering all the pamphlets and things is beyond her capabilities. We have to go to four meetings a year, one in each season, starting at New Year at the meeting hall. But as I say, they've been cancelled for Corona. And that's basically it. It's a very light one. I know other communities where you have to, if you're a man, you have to join the part-time fire service.
Oh, yeah, we have to do that too, except that my husband doesn't do it. We're probably supposed to do that, but we travel a lot also, and that's another point, is the people in the countryside, they do have a lot of duties. They don't feel that they can just be gone all the time. And even when my next door neighbor goes to visit her daughter and grandkids on the mainland, she'll come back early if she has a duty to do. So there is kind of this feeling that you're an integral part of this community and you have to pull your weight. We probably don't pull our weight in some areas. We try to make up for it in others, but that's not really how the Japanese way of thinking goes. Yeah.
As I said before, our area is not too strict because they are scared about pushing each other too much. And the whole system's based on the idea of there being 3 generations in one house. And therefore, there's always someone around who can go to a meeting or something. It was just me and my wife. We both work full time. There are times when it's just impossible. Like my wife is a nurse. She's not going to cancel her shift at the hospital to go and sit in an empty meeting hall. And they've been very good with that. They sort of understand that. But the year where usually I would be the hancho. It's usually the head of the household that gets it, which in Japan is usually the husband or the father, grandfather. But we split it for obvious language reasons more than anything. The first meeting of the year is like the financial meeting. They talk about all the money that came in last year and what it was spent on and what the plans are for the next year. And my wife was working at that one, so I had to go along. And you were saying before about because of language things, you're not always have to do everything. I was sitting at the top table, so the bigger area, there's 4 hanchos, and I was one of them. So we're all sitting at the top table with our paperwork and stuff, and everybody else sitting out. And a big discussion was got up about how unfair it was that I was expected to do this. So they're all discussing away in Japanese as if I wasn't there. It started like, and it was in a nice way of somebody going, this is a real shame. Like, we're going to discuss the finances today. And yes, he speaks Japanese, but like, this is complex stuff. And he's going to have to sign financial contracts and stuff. Like, this is a shame. It's like, it's not fair on him to expect him to do this. And someone else piped up, and it's still the nicest thing anyone's said in the community, piped up saying, well, he's part of the community, so what do you expect? Like, no special treatment just because he's a foreigner. And I was like, yes, that. If you want to be accepted, it also means sitting there with financial documents going, I don't know what's happening, someone help me.
Yeah, good point.
So yeah, that was nice. We were included in that. But at the end of that year, it's like, right, okay, we're taking a step back. We're done we've done our cycle. And I think it's almost a 20-year cycle. It goes around all the households.
Wow. I had no idea. It probably does here too, but they probably figure there's no way this couple can manage. We'll have turned it into Little America or Little Australia.
Yeah. I mean, I did not get involved when I was at the meetings. I was just nodding with everything. Like, what does the majority think? Yes, I'm fine with that. Stamp, done.
I used to go to we had monthly meetings called Shimatsukuri Inkai. It's a monthly island meeting about what's happening, and they make all the decisions for everything. And I had to go to them for a while just for some business reasons and for like a year. And I noticed after a while that the guy who was running the meeting, he would just look at me and say, "That's right, isn't it, Amy?" And then I knew to say, "Yes, I agree." He just would kind of phrase it so that I knew that I needed to agree on this and that it was to my benefit. So I think they're good about that kind of stuff. And the important thing was that I was there. Yeah. So, Iain, I'd like to ask everyone at the end of the show what their favorite books on Japan are. Now, this can be anything. It could be a book that you feel was really great, but never got enough credit for being such a good book. It could be a book that you go back to again and again, or a book that has influenced your life or your decisions you've made, and somehow anything's game. So let's hear it.
Since we're talking about the countryside, talking about living in the countryside, I have to mention, first of all, the anthology, Inaka, Portraits of Life in Rural Japan. It's a really good book by lots of different writers, many of whom were new to me, some I already know, about different aspects of living in rural Japan. So, if anyone listening is interested in what we've been talking about, you've got to check that book out. One of the things I thought when I was writing Only Gaijin, one of the reasons I did it, is that there isn't a huge amount of books out there from sort of foreigners' perspective and long-term residents in Japan writing about them. There's my book, there's your book, which is excellent. There's a few others. Alex Kerr's Lost Japan is definitely worth checking out. And going back a bit, people have to read Isabella Bird's Unbeaten Tracks, her travels around Japan. Some of it hasn't aged, doesn't really chime with the modern world, but just as an insight into sort of how rural Japan has changed, I guess, over the last 150 years. She goes up through Tohoku and up into Hokkaido. I still can't believe she actually did what she did.
All by herself.
And, people who'd been in Japan at the time, I've been doing research into another person who's in Japan at the time, and they're kind of connected with her, and sort of people gossiping about her, like, "Oh my God, this crazy lady's off up into the north. What's she doing?" And, surprised when she came back perfectly fine. How there is not a Netflix series of that book, I don't know.
Because she traveled all around the world, not just Japan. So that would make a great Netflix series.
Yeah. You could have series after series, like one series Japan, one series her next travels. It's Netflix, get on it. If you want a script writer, I would happily adapt that. There's a lot more actually really good fiction books about rural Japan by foreigners and by a lot of Japanese writers. I know you had David Joyner on here a couple of episodes ago, so his book Kanazawa is excellent for dealing with a lot of what we've been talking about today with I think that's an American man and a Japanese wife, and the tensions between living in the countryside, living in the city, and expectations there. It's a really nice twist that it's the husband really wants to live in the countryside and the wife really wants to move to Tokyo and be in the biggest possible city. Japanese literature and translation, Shion Miura's The Easy Life in Kamasari is great. Hiroko Yamada's Whole, which is about Japanese people moving out into the countryside and dealing with the community there.
That's a great place for people to start if their interest has been piqued, or especially if they want to move out to the countryside themselves. And I think also something we didn't discuss is that it's very economical to live in the countryside. And it's so doable to find a house, because really real estate doesn't have a lot of value in the countryside because there's just not enough people for all the houses in Japan. And that's going to be a continuing trend.
Absolutely, yeah. It's definitely worth doing. A lot more Japanese people are doing it now. You're getting more movements of people sick of the city life, sick of the rat race, moving out and rejuvenating these places. So it's great to see.
Okay, well, thanks so much for coming on the Books on Asia podcast, Iain.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. Check out their May 2022 release, Japanese Cinema, A Personal Journey by Peter Cowie. It's an informal yet informed journey through the classic works of Japanese cinema and their visionary directors. Available at www.stonebridge.com. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.